Hi, welcome back to A Case of Books. Today I'm going to talk through my favourite books that were published in 2016. I read 159 books this year and I genuinely enjoyed most of them, so it's been pretty difficult to pick a top 10, but I've ended up choosing the ones that have stayed with me for the longest. First up is a book that's here because I just haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I read it, and that's Radiance by Catherine M. Valenti. I really enjoyed it when I first read it, but I wouldn't have necessarily expected it to crop up here, but as I said, it's one that's been completely stuck in my head ever since. It's a really unusual book and it's quite an eccentric mix of genres. It is literary, it's science fiction, it's fantasy, it's even got some sort of mild horror elements at times. When I talked about it in my video in March, one of the quotes actually ended up on the paperback cover, which you can see, and I stand by what I said. I love it because it's heady and dreamy and it's exquisitely beautifully written. It's a kind of Art Deco steampunk version of the 1920s where space travel has already been achieved, and it's about a very dysfunctional father-daughter duo of filmmakers and what happens in the aftermath of the daughter's disappearance. If you liked the merge of historical and fantastical and the intricate writing style of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, then I think you would like Radiance very much. Next up is the only non-fiction title on my top 10, and it's The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. This book fundamentally contributed to my understanding of the constructions of gender, and I learned an awful lot from it, but it's also a really good read. You have to concentrate quite hard to follow it. It's not an easy read, but it completely rewards the attention that it requires. It's a mixture of memoir and straight non-fiction, as it's framed around Nelson's real life, but she brings in an awful lot of other writers and philosophers and thinks about that in quite an academic way. It's incredibly smart, but it's also warm and at times really quite moving. I've compared it to I Love Dick because it really does feel like one of those books that's going to be a game changer in the way we think about different ways of being a woman. Next up is a collection of short stories called What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. Some books you really enjoy at the time, but when you think back on them, you really struggle to remember any of the details. But this is the exact opposite. Several of the stories and specific scenes have stuck with me, even though it's months and months ago that I read it. The stories are loosely interconnected and revolve around themes of keys and locks and libraries and secrets. While some of them are sort of full fantasy and some of them are more strictly contemporary, most of them are what we'd call magical realism, which is my favourite genre. The stories and the writing are magical and dark and completely entrancing, much like Amy Bender's collection of short stories, The Colour Master. Next up is a book that I only read just at the very end of the year, and I'm so glad I found time for it. It's Margaret I by Danielle Dutton. It's a fictionalised version of the real life of Margaret of Cavendish, who was a 17th century woman. Although it is definitely fiction, much of Margaret's actual writing is woven through the narrative, and part of the joy is not really knowing where Margaret's voice ends and Danielle Dutton's voice begins. It's profound whilst also being funny and charming, and it's feminist whilst also being really romantic at times. A very natural comparison to make is with Orlando by Virginia Woolf, both because of the style of writing but also because Woolf herself was a fan of Margaret and wrote about her herself. Next up is another book that I read early in the year and really stayed with me, and it's Under the Udala Trees by Chinelo Oparanta. It's a story of faith and love and family set during and in the aftermath of the Biafran War in Nigeria. The book is both a war story and a love story, and I think the way that Oparanta manages to balance these is the real strength of the book, as well as her gorgeous writing. It really made me think about the intersection between sexuality and faith, but above all, it's a really engaging, beautiful read for fans of Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, which also takes place during the Biafran War. Next up is the book that I wanted to win this year's Man Booker Prize, and it's Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeleine Tien. I thought this epic story of several generations of a Chinese family was staggeringly good. It's smart and lyrical and completely engrossing, and I really loved the way that themes of music were woven through it. I really loved the way she explored ideas of the stories we tell about ourselves and our families, and I really enjoyed the contrast of the almost fable-like way that several of the family members told their stories with the brutal reality of living in communist China. It reminded me of the way that gardening and the art of tattooing was woven through the history of the Japanese occupation of Malaysia in the Garden of Eden Mists. Now, I haven't been doing these books in any particular order, but I do think the next four are probably my top four of the year. And first of all is The Portable Devlin by Elizabeth Mackenzie, which is one of the first books that I read this year. This is a book I knew I was going to love from the very first page, and it manages to encompass so much of what I like in books. The writing is warm and smart, the book is insightful, it has a brilliant heroine, it's quirky but not self-consciously so, and most importantly it has a really satisfying ending that fits the story it's been telling perfectly. And all of those things reminded me of one of my favourites from last year, which was Vendela Beda's The Diver's Clothes Lie Empty. Next up is the new book by one of my absolute favourite writers, and it's Autumn by Ali Smith. I genuinely don't know how she manages to publish a book every year and for them all to be so extraordinarily good. This book is the first in a series of 4 seasonal books where she reflects very contemporaneously on what is happening in the world. Autumn is nominally about Brexit, but it's also about so much more than that. It's about unlikely friendships, it's about mothers and daughters, and it's about stories and reading. I struggle to articulate quite how beautiful and transporting I find Ali Smith's language, and for that reason I'm going to do a potentially unhelpful comparison, which is with How to Be Both, one of her previous novels, because basically if you already like Ali Smith you won't be disappointed with Autumn. My penultimate choice is a graphic novel, The 100 Nights of Hero by Isabel Greenberg. It's a queer, feminist, loose retelling of the Thousand Nights story, and it is triumphant and funny and sharp and sad. One of my absolute favourite things in books is stories within stories, and this uses that frame to great effect. And the artwork is gorgeous. It's the sort of book that I want to buy another copy just so I can cut out some of the pages and frame them in my flat. I'd also say it's a really good introduction to graphic novels for people who aren't very confident choosing graphic novels that they think they'll like. Not to mention the fact that in this year that has been somewhat ropey, it's also a beacon of hope and a testament to the power of storytelling. If you like feminist retellings of old stories like Through the Woods by Emily Carroll, then it's definitely one for you. On to my last pick for the books of the year, and it's another novel that I read right at the tail end of the year, and I'm very glad I did, and it's The Power by Naomi Alderman. I loved this book. It is a sharp and uncompromising look at what would happen in the world if women were the ones with the most physical strength. This manifests in being able to shoot sort of electrical sparks from their hands, and whilst reading it, I genuinely felt the electricity in me. I love the way that Alderman resists a simple narrative. She doesn't say that women would be better at ruling the world, and it's a genuinely feminist message saying that one gender isn't innately better than the other. It's a book that I was completely engrossed in the whole time that I was reading it, and it's a book that I need to talk to people about as soon as I'd finished it. It's also the book that I've been recommending the most, I think, this year. The natural comparison is with The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. So those are my favourite 10 books of the year. I'd love to know if you'd read any of them and what you made of them, or what your favourite books were. Please do remember to subscribe and like this video, and I'll be back very soon with a video about my favourite books that are coming out in January.